Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from Omdia, brought to you by Informatech. Today's webinar is Delivering Direct Routing for Microsoft Teams. With Microsoft Teams now capable of becoming an enterprise's business phone system through direct routing, time is of the essence for service providers to be prepared to sell and deliver direct routing for Teams. Our panel will explore market characteristics and buyers' expectations when choosing a SIP trunking provider for direct routing, and how CSPs and MSPs are winning business today and what will be required moving forward. Our webinar is co-presented by Omdia and our partner, Ribbon Communications. My name is Alan Tatara, Senior Event Manager for the Omdia webinar team, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. Before we get started, let me just highlight some of the features available for you on this webinar. So the console you're looking at is completely customizable. You can open, close, move, or resize any of the windows that you have open on your screen and arrange the console as you like. Now at the bottom of your console, you're going to see a number of application widgets, and I do want to mention the resource list widget. For this is where you will find additional material about our topic, including the downloadable slide deck from our session, as well as other valuable information. You'll also see a Twitter widget, which means you can tweet directly from the console, and today we're using the hashtag direct routing. We will also have a live Q&A session after our presentation, so please remember to submit your questions or comments at any time by using the Q&A box on the left side of your screen. Note that this webinar is being recorded and that the on-demand version will be sent out to you within about 24 hours. And finally, if you experience any technical issues, all you have to do is click on that question mark widget and you will get the answers that you need. So now let me introduce our panel. First leading our discussion is Diane Myers. Diane is Senior Research Director in the VoIP, UC, and IMS segment at Omdia. And rounding out our panel, we have Greg Zweig. Greg is the Director of Solutions Marketing at Ribbon Communications. So welcome to both Diane and Greg. It's great to have you with us today. So now let me turn things over to Diane so we can get started. Diane?
Great, thanks, Alan, and I'd like to extend my welcome to everybody. As Alan mentioned, right, we're going to talk about direct routing to Microsoft Teams today, and I'm going to start the presentation off with just to give you guys a little bit of background and what we think and what in terms of how the market is developing and why this is important for you as a CSP or a system integrator to start thinking about. So, this shouldn't be a big surprise, right? I mean, this is something we've been talking about for a number of years now, but the transition to, I shouldn't even say the transition to SIP is happening. We're more than well underway, right? I mean, more than 50% here in the U.S. of connections now are over SIP for businesses, for small, mid-market, and large enterprises. The data here on the left is from a survey we did a year ago. We'll do it again this summer. But it asks businesses, right, mid-market and large enterprises, what they're using today. And note that many businesses have not, it's not all or nothing, right? They may have a certain percentage on SIP for their connectivity needs, and some may be on traditional, PRIs, for example, or phone connections, and that's because most, many mid-market large enterprises have pretty sophisticated requirements, right? They may be doing something different for their call center than what they're doing for the rest of the business, and they may be doing things differently for remote or branch offices than what they do for headquarters. So we do see that the transition is a bit of a mix, right? But I think the point here that I really just want to just reiterate is that businesses of all types, right? Voice is moving. The voice connections are moving to SIP, and we're not at the beginning stages. We're well into that transition. And this is from a survey we did earlier this year, and it's more around UC, right, and voice, not specific to SIP. But I guess my point that I wanted to really to make, the point I really wanted to make with this is that today, this is based on survey data, but roughly 30 or a third of businesses still have their on-premise systems, their PBX or UC systems are on-prem. And that represents a traditional SIP trunking, right? If they're IP, then we can move to SIP. And then the rest of the business is, the rest of the businesses are either UCaaS, multi-tenant, UC as a service, UC in the cloud, or they're doing some kind of private cloud, right? So some private instances telephony and UC, right? So they're dedicated. That's more of a dedicated cloud versus the multi-tenant cloud. And that represents, right? So we think about the traditional SIP trunking market being to on-prem, but that's really started to shift. And there is an opportunity, right, in that you see in the cloud, whether it be private or UCaaS. And that has really been driven a lot by initiatives from Microsoft and some others where you have to bring your own broadband, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Today, right, if we think about, or not even today, if you think about 2 years ago, right, you could use SIP directly, right? You contact your SIP trunking provider and to connect your IP to your prem, right? And maybe it's in your own private cloud, right? So there's even some in the private cloud. And if you were moving to UCaaS, right, or something multi-tenant in the cloud, then those providers were typically contracting and bundling the SIP connections, right? They were wholesaling SIP from other providers, and that was part of the service. Well, this is where we start to see the shift, and particularly up market, as more businesses, larger enterprises, more complicated businesses are moving to cloud-based services like Microsoft Teams, and you have providers, right, like Microsoft, who don't necessarily want to do the full carrier class, be a regulated entity, and so you really, as a business, are going to be bringing, right? So a business is going to be going out and contracting with a CSP for their SIP trunks, right, to route back into the Microsoft cloud for Teams. And it's not just Microsoft, right? We're going to focus here on Microsoft today because that's where we see the big initiative and a big pull, but we're seeing it happen in other areas too. So just to think about that, where, yes, SIP has always been on-prem, but now more and more cloud providers are kind of requiring you to bring your own SIP, right? Bring your own connectivity to the party. So what do you need to get started? And we're going to go into this in more detail. I'm only kind of just going to touch on it here and give you some high-level points. So what you need to be thinking about with your customers, right? You're a service provider, you're getting into direct routing or offering direct routing to Microsoft, but you need to, in turn, be working with your businesses, right, your customers, to make sure that they could even move down that step. So what are some of those initial requirements? You need to make sure they have the right license package with Office 365, right, so that they actually can do calling, right? And that is usually the E5 package or an add-on for E3, right, so they can do the calling. You need to be able, right, to provide those direct routes, right? So you need to make sure you have, your SIP trunks are interoperable with Microsoft Teams, right, so that you can actually connect into those. What we're finding, right, and this is actually a pretty important piece that we find in talking to a lot of enterprises that are actually starting down this path, is that you need that Microsoft certified SBC. But what we're finding is that actually is coming almost first, right, for some companies. But if they're not, then as a integrator, as a service provider who's consulting and working with the businesses, you need to make sure that they're having that piece, whether you're helping them or they're doing that on their own. And internally, or whether they're using third parties, there has to be some trained staff management. This is not something that you just plug and play and up and running, right? There has to be a transition plan, and there has to be staff, right? Whether they're using outside counsel or they're doing it internal, but to work with the setup and to do this, right? So there's a lot that is placed in the hands within the business to make sure all of this is working correctly. And I'm just going to end here, right? So we do a lot of surveys with businesses around enterprise services, and we always ask, right? And we ask a lot of questions in terms of what are they looking for in a provider, how do they evaluate a provider, and what we hear pretty consistently, to me, is pretty fundamental capabilities, and I think it's just worth reiterating, right? So for businesses who are contracting with a SIP trunking provider, they want a reliable service, right? Voice is still a pretty critical component to a business, and if they cannot communicate in a reliable and in a high quality way with with their customers and their partners and the employees, then it's kind of a non-starter. So you really want a reliable, high quality service. You want to be easy to do business with, and we're seeing that a lot in the SIP trunking world, right? A lot of businesses now want to be able to have a lot of flexibility, and we're seeing that's that flexibility of deploying and provisioning SIP trunks is an important component. and certification, and in this case, certification with Microsoft Teams, for example. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Greg to kind of dig a little bit deeper into, definitely the different pieces you need to consider. So Greg, you're in charge now.
Thank you, Diane. I've been waiting to hear that my whole life. Anyhow, thanks very much for that information. And I think what Diane is seeing, and many of you know, she's probably one of the most well-respected analysts in our industry relative to the SIP trunking environment, is that there's this transition from SIP trunks supporting traditional PBXs to cloud services is really been changed dramatically in just the last 90 days. And if you look at something like Microsoft Teams, if you go back to November, I think they had something like 20 million daily active users. By March, they had significant growth. I think they were in the 30s, if memory serves me correctly. By the end of April, they were at 75 million daily active users. So obviously what's happened is we've had this huge uptick as a result of the worldwide pandemic. What's so significant about that is not, and most of those users, to be honest, today are not using Teams for calling. They're using it for screen share and the typical file share, things of that nature. But I believe, and I think Ribbon as a whole, we believe that, it's very unusual for CIOs of large organizations in particular to be in a position where the training is already done. If you look at how traditionally what has slowed enterprises down as they transition their PBX, it's often the training of the users. And so suddenly we're in a situation where CIOs have 75 million daily active users that are all trained, and it's only a matter of time before they start to try and consider, hey, how do I leverage that base of trained users? And one of the easiest things to do, particularly when there's going to be cost pressure on IT in 2020 and 21, is to figure out how to transition calling off of a legacy PBX and onto an asset they already own and pay for, in this case, Teams. So what we see happening is we expect in late 2020 and 2021 the volume of inquiries about Teams calling to go up substantially, and we're already seeing that. We deploy some of our software in the Azure marketplace, and we see a tremendous uptick in the number of people all trying the trials and pulling down permanent licenses because they can buy it online. So we're seeing that linear growth already starting, and it's our belief for our CSP and MSP customers that they need to move now in order to be prepared, because if you wait until the summer of 2021, a year from now, I think it's going to be too late, because what's going to start to happen is the research and the buying process is going to have started, and you're not going to be in a strong position to start launching services at that point. And of course, a big part of launching those services is determining whether your own network is ready. It might sound obvious, but the first thing that everyone has to do is do the testing themselves. Get their own pilot programs in place. And you need this for two reasons. One, obviously, to make sure that your own systems are properly set up to support Teams. And the other thing is you need to develop your own support organization. There's nothing more frustrating for customers than to deploy a new service and have everybody in the support chain tell them, well, I've never done this before. And of course, there are some unique capabilities that a Teams deployment requires. One of the things that's important is that Teams typically supports G722 or Silk codec, so you need transcoding, because obviously most service provider networks are probably 711. You may have some other native codecs in there, but that's the most common. Obviously, you need an edge strategy for SBCs. Diane mentioned that earlier, that it's a requirement from Microsoft to have an edge SBC. You also need to think about the fact that customers are not probably going to do wholesale migrations. There's a big market out there for service providers to be able to sell centralized routing and SIM ring services and other assets in order to be able to transition, potentially leave the legacy PBX in place for a period of time and enable Teams as well, right? There's also a big issue around E911, particularly in certain states. Now, as service providers and MSPs on the phone, you know probably what your local legislative requirements are. But remember that these sort of systems are built with nomadic users. So you don't know where a user is going to be. You don't know that 20% of the people you're connected to are in a state that has different E911 requirements. So you really got to look at how, as an organization, you have your E911 services set up, and you need to be able to support those nomadic users. Probably, I'm just guessing, but probably 80 or 90% of all Teams users are not going to use a hard phone. So that means there's really no traditional address or desk location that you can count on the person being at. So you need to account for that. You also need to start thinking about security certificates. This isn't kind of an arcane matter, but Teams Teams and many other UCaaS solutions now have, and rightly so, a significant set of requirements around key exchange and security certificates. As you increase the number of customers on your network, you need a plan for tracking those certificates and the expiration dates. And what's happening is, because of supercomputing, the time frame in which a certificate is valid keeps getting shortened because there's greater and greater fear that the encryption will be broken. So you need a strategic plan inside your own organization to be able to manage those certificates. And of course, it's not just a technical set of discussions. One of the things that I always joke about is, if you can't Google it, it doesn't exist. And I say that because if you think about how most of us buy today, what's the first thing we do? Oh, we need something for the office, for our personal lives, whatever it is. We go up on the web and we Google to educate ourselves to see who's doing it. I would encourage everyone on this call who's a CSP or MSP, go Google your brand name and Microsoft Teams and see if anything comes up. Shockingly, I think you'll find that the vast majority of CSPs don't even have yet a dedicated page for this service. And like I said, if you can't Google it, then for all intents and purposes, even if the actual service exists inside your network, most people aren't going to ask for it or look for it. And keep in mind, too, that the 30-year-old buyer today, which is a big chunk of the IT organization today, 30 years or younger, has spent their entire life with a smartphone. So you need to plan your web engagement and your sales engagement around that model, not just around the old model of, hey, you call into a contact center, you spend literally, and I've done this, a minute and 30 seconds traversing the menus, going through residential services and the other 43 choices before you get to business services. Right? It has to be an online experience. We have major tier ones, traditional players like AT&T, learning to sell online. Any major provider can do it. It takes time and energy, but it can be done. You also need to make sure that your sales organization is trained and ready to answer the questions. If they don't sound confident, people just go down the street, right? It sounds basic, but these are the basic building blocks that it takes in order to deliver the service or sell the service, not just have it available from a technical perspective. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, and Diane kind of touched on this earlier in the survey data, she talked about the fact that the traditional model was the premises PBX. As we move to this model where service can be anywhere, the traditional model of PRI or SIP trunk into a premises gave the CSP, the communication service provider, sort of a geographic edge. As we move into this model of Teams and other UCaaS platforms, there is no geographic boundaries, right? So from most customers' perspective, it's all the same. And the problem is, if it's all the same, that equals a less total spend, because what people are going to do is they're going to say, hey, it's all the same, it doesn't matter, I can buy it anywhere, and I'll just buy the one that's the lowest price. So as a result of that, service providers really need to think about how they're going to differentiate their Teams offer. Things like service assurance, things like failover, LTE backup. You can actually bundle in the wireless, particularly if you already have a wireless practice. Developing a security practice. Those are the kinds of things that really make an impact, because fundamentally you have to plan for commoditization. You don't have to necessarily embrace it, but you have to plan for it and recognize that it's going to impact all of these points. You also need to be able to consider, how am I going to reduce my cost as I go through this process, right? And for those of you who don't know Ribbon well, there's a we have a strong position already in SIP trunking around the globe, literally millions and millions of seats, right? And we see the same kinds of issues day in and day out, right? We see too many providers that are blind, basically, once the traffic leaves their core. We believe you need some sort of an intelligent edge to tell you what's going on. And you also need that to prioritize traffic. We had a question, we had some early questions, that people brought up as they were logging into the webinar. And one of the questions was, well, what do I do if I don't have an MPLS network? Well, that's a good example where having an edge device that prioritizes traffic really makes a difference, right? And you also want to understand what's happening across your network from a macro perspective. So, because the reality is, as the service provider, whether it's Microsoft's fault or somebody's LAN problem or whatever it is, you're going to get blamed. And you'll be the first point where people will call in and ask for troubleshooting. So it's up to you to figure out, what tools do I need to put in place to manage cost so I don't take every, and it could be fewer dollars over time. I don't take every dollar and drive it back into my support function instead of making money at it. And if you do that right, you also give customers value in the sense that you can proactively resolve their issues, or at least proactively alert them that there's an issue, so that you keep churn down. The other thing to keep in mind is there's likely a number of service providers on the phone that own the last mile. We believe strongly that you need to make sure you understand how you're going to use this to differentiate. There are a number of over-the-top providers. If you read Diane's information, I think Twilio today is the 4th or 5th largest SIP trunking provider in North America, depending on, she can give the details on that. That's very interesting when you consider the fact that they don't own any physical assets, right? So that tells us that there's a gap here, and that our providers who own the last mile or have a core network need to figure out how to use that as a differentiator. How do I use quality of service? How do I use service assurance? How do I use my proactive state to my benefit? And we do see some of the big players already doing that. We have customers like you see on the right-hand side, right? They've already deployed. It's proven that I didn't turn off my phone. They've already deployed, right, 250,000 edge devices. And the reason they're doing that is because they recognize the value of that last mile. And they also see the end devices and the whole SD-WAN migration as a way to sort of differentiate and cash in on the migration that's happening here. And I guess the other thing that I would sort of remind people of is that security in this whole environment is not just a box. Yes, as Ribbon, we're a large provider of session border controllers, but there's a lot more to security than just a single item. And oftentimes when we talk to customers, I hear people say, well, it's not easy to sell security. And to some extent, I appreciate that. It's somewhat nebulous. But keep in mind, right, I would bet that most of the people on the phone, they already buy some sort of a credit reporting tool. They might have file backup at home. I'm sure they have something like a virus protection already something that they own. The bottom line is that customers will buy security services. And the risk today is not just toll fraud. And for better or for worse, that's often been how our industry describes security from a voice perspective. Unfortunately, in a world of state-sponsored terrorism and other crazy stuff that goes on, many times a voice network is not being attacked because it's a voice network. It's simply a side door into a larger network. And as more and more of the network is, on a single set of pipes, that becomes more and more important. There was just a story in the last couple of weeks about the San Francisco airport where Russian hackers hacked into the construction website. And you say to yourself, well, what do Russian hackers want with a construction website? I mean, I'm sure they're not looking for paving contracts. Well, the reason they hacked into that site was to gain credentials. Because you know what they know? They know that contractors for the airport do lots of different things, and they use the same passwords. So they knew, hey, if I get access to the construction website passwords and information, I'll probably get access to other critical parts of the network. And so when we start talking about voice security, we need to think about it as more than just this toll fraud issue. We need to think about all the other points of ingress and egress that a potential hacker could get into if they hack the network. And so we really need to make that part of our practice. We need to make it holistic. It needs to tie into other assets in the security business, and it needs to be proactive in the sense that you need to be creating reports and other services that drive that practice and make it valuable to customers. And so with that, I think we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the case studies and some service providers who've already sort of embraced some of these activities. So I'm going to kind of talk about a couple of customers, one in the U.S. and one in the U.K., and just spend a second or two talking about what they're doing, because I think they've done a really fine job of embracing what's happening in the Teams marketplace. One is Bandwidth. I'm sure many people on the call know them. They've been a long-time player since the early 2000s in SIP trunks, one of the really the first organizations to embrace SIP trunking. They've adopted a really focused Teams message. If you go up on their website, if you Google Bandwidth and Teams, you'll find dedicated pages, you'll find dedicated messaging. They staked out a position in E911, which I think is really a great spot. It's differentiated. There aren't many players doing that today, and they've included nomadic users, which again is a big challenge for the CIO types. And the other thing that's interesting, and it's interesting from our perspective, is in order to support the edge environment, what they're focused on is creating a strategy around spinning up software SBCs in the Azure cloud for individual users. And I think this is really interesting because, it's a big departure of the traditional service provider model. Says, hey, I own the hardware, I do everything inside my network. And obviously they still have core SBCs in their environment. But for the edge, they're focused on creating a model that's dynamic and actually using the Azure cloud and leveraging the fact that that Teams is in the Azure cloud, and obviously their SBC is in the cloud. So they have sort of an all Azure model, which I think is very interesting. It's lightweight, it's quick, it gives them a lot of deployment flexibility. So I think they're really one of the strongest players in the U.S. in terms of the way they've gone after the Teams market.
Greg, let me ask you a question about this, and I do agree, right? Bandwidth, I think, has done a lot in this space around Microsoft Teams. But I think a lot of businesses, right, or even like service providers, right, like we have here on the call today, wouldn't think about SBCs in the cloud from an edge strategy, right? So in this instance, right, with Bandwidth, can you talk a little bit about, as they market out their trunks, right, their direct routing to enterprises, are they bundling in the SBC as part of that service since they're kind of spinning it up in the cloud?
Yeah, and I think it is bundled. I think it's, relatively speaking, transparent to the customer. But what's nice about something like using an all software cloud-based SBC is you can dynamically spin it up. So in other words, you're not paying for licenses as a service provider you're not using, and you're not having to charge the customer for capacity they're not using. Basically, I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's pretty close to push button. Especially for someone like them.
Yeah, and I think the difference here is, right, that we're talking about an all-cloud solution, right? Teams is in the cloud, whereas I think, traditionally service providers, CSPs and enterprises would think about putting that edge SBC on site, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to realize, right, that we are talking about a cloud service, and while the edge is your business, the application is in the cloud, and that's that edge, right?
Right. And there may be still occasions when they do deploy on the edge. I mean, there are certain things. The physical SBC has the key benefit of the fact that it has you can put traditional ports on there for things like there's many customers who are going to migrate to Teams and they're going to leave a legacy call center or contact center in. They may need some PRI drops because that's what that it's a 10-year-old Aspect Genesis, whatever, and they don't want to spend the money to upgrade it. So in those instances, physical presence may still be a good idea. But if at the end of the day somebody needs, 7, 10 channels and they want them on Tuesday, the bandwidth can deliver that.
Right, because they can spin it up easily from the cloud.
Right,
so.
Exactly.
Great. I know you have one other example, so why don't we move to that one then?
I do. I have Pure IP, who's based in the UK, and they've really been a first mover in this space, sort of akin to bandwidth, but more so focused on the team side in the sense of first mover on SIP trunks. A couple things they've done. First off, they're not as big a brand as some of the other names, obviously in the UK, but they've created credibility in their space. They've done things. They're Microsoft Gold partner. They've built a really sophisticated online sales journey for customers. We talked about this earlier. I mean, you go up on their site, you click through, it steps you right through the sections. Very, very simple, makes it straightforward for somebody looking to buy. They're not all confused about, with our telco terminology that we throw at people. And they've also worked hard to stake out a kind of a unique position around worldwide deployments, and I think they recognize, and UK is a great example of it. There's many companies based in the UK who have locations around the globe, and they recognize that there's a need from a Teams perspective to have PSTN access in those environments. They're doing a slightly different model. They're using hardware at the edge, but they're centrally managing it all. So again, they're kind of focused on serviceability and support so that they can manage the macro network and the individual location.
Yeah, so, both with Pure IP and bandwidth, they are working with that edge equipment, right, the SBC for their customers, right? In this case, it's deployed at the edge, and in the case of bandwidth, it's in the cloud. But I think it's important to recognize both of these are working with that SBC, that edge equipment.
Right.
And that's not always the case, right? I mean, I know plenty of Teams deployments where the business is going out and, securing those devices themselves, right?
Yeah, and I think that's probably especially the case in a very large enterprise. If you're, XYZ big bank and you have, 700 or 800 trunks coming into your environment, you're probably picking out your own SBC or something more like our large scale, like 5400 SBC, which is designed for thousands of sessions. I think that's, but relatively speaking, that's the minority of customers out in the world. They might be big and they might be important, but if you look at the raw numbers are actually probably customers 0 to 100 seats.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway for a CSP in this case, where especially if they have historically been doing SIP trunking and maybe they haven't been doing SBCs, as they move into more of a direct routing service to Microsoft Teams, that it would be good for them to be working with an SBC or vendor, right, and have that as part of the service, knowing that the customer ultimately is going to need it, right? So take that kind of decision, out of the hands of the business, and then way they know it works. It's it works with the Microsoft environment. It works with the SIP environment inside the CSP, and kind of takes that decision out of the hands of the enterprise, right, or the business, right? Makes it a little bit easier for them.
And and I think the other thing, and I really do worry about this whole commoditization issue. If providers don't come up with a strategy around differentiation and value-added services, then they're leaving themselves in a position where they have to compete with the lowest cost provider. Because in theory, there's no difference. Even though you might own the last mile, you might have a fantastic network with all these levels of redundancy and resiliency, but you can't impart that information to a customer. So from their perspective, hey, it's $6 or more a month. Well, what am I paying for besides the brand?
Yeah, in the case of Pure IP, this would be my last question to you is, how do you feel that they have really created that differentiation, right? What really stands out in that case?
I think if you look at how they have built out their public presence, you see a certain level of finesse in that, and you can tell that the people who are doing this understand how to connect to teams. And I think if you're an IT manager in a company and you're scratching your head, because to be fair, right, there's a lot of people in the business world who are experts at Microsoft. They're experts at Cisco routing or whatever other certifications. They know very little about telco. They inherited telco from somebody whose experience was Nortel or Avaya or something else, and they don't really understand this stuff. So they're looking for people who can really help them through that journey. And that's one of the reasons why I comment on the fact that the websites and web assets have to be good, because they're not comfortable with these things. And so if they don't have a good experience, if they can't pick up the phone and talk to somebody who knows more than them, then I think they're going to move on and pick somebody different. I lost you, Diane.
Sorry, I was on mute. I was talking to
Well, did you say anything good?
I did. I was. I was saying that these two examples, right? You gave that talked about how they are offering and running and managing the SBC. But to be clear, right? I mean, if a customer has an SBC, we kind of talked about that. Especially ones that maybe have a little bit more sophisticated requirements. Providers are, in this case, like a bandwidth or Pure IP, will continue to support that, right? It's not one or the other.
Sure.
Right.
At the end of the day, the whole purpose of a core network and the products like we make on the core side is to assure interoperability. You got to be able to work with anyone. As long as it's a standards-based solution, it needs to work in your network. And that goes back to that whole very beginning where you got to test stuff and see for yourself, make sure it works, and know whatever knobs or buttons you need to push, because you're going to get blamed. If it doesn't work, you're the 800 number that's going to get called, and they're going to say, hey, I can't dial.
Right. So I just, we're going to move on to a couple more slides, but I just want to remind everyone we have a lot of good questions coming in. But you have a couple more minutes to put them in, because we're going to start those here in a little bit. So, Greg, why don't you go forward and kind of talk about, kind of why people should think about the ribbon and how ribbon kind of fits into this whole scenario.
I'll try and keep it brief, because I do want to go to the question and answer. I guess, our core value proposition in this whole thing is that, fundamentally, we've been involved with Microsoft really since the days of OCS and Link. We're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're Microsoft co-sale ready. Across our network, whether it's the core SBCs, it's our Edge portfolio, they're all designed to interoperate. Many, millions of SIP trunks, as I said earlier, are already deployed with our solution. About almost 18 months ago or 2 years ago now, we acquired Edgewater Networks that extended our Edge portfolio. We've had for a number of years our SBC 1000 and 2000. We have their software editions, which you can deploy on a virtual machine, or in the case of the software edition Lite, you can deploy that right in the Azure marketplace. Literally, you can go up there and get a 30-day free trial and boom, get it running in a couple of minutes' time. And then overall, I think that a couple of key things that we end up delivering this whole equation is the fact that we can deliver up to the service provider the centralized reporting capability and the proactive security tools that they need in order to manage this and manage their costs and ultimately profitability, and be able to deploy in volume. Because as I said at the beginning of the conversation, right, I think there's a window of opportunity here over maybe the next year to position yourself as a leader in Teams direct routing. And if you miss that window, it's not to say you'll get no business. That's a ridiculous statement, but you're going to miss being considered a leader in the space. And we've seen time and time again that new entrants come into the market, they do a better job on the marketing and sort of support side, and customers begin to migrate, or they do a little quick check and they get a couple of lines in one location, and suddenly they move their entire environment over to it. And in today's world, where there are no barriers to entry against something like this, it's critical that service providers have an answer and are prepared for where the market's going, not just react to where it is. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Diane. Let me flip the slide for you here, and you can just wrap it up, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Great. Perfect, thanks. And we do have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to kind of breeze through these, right? I just wanted to touch on a few, I think, really key points, right? Or if I had, three things to kind of think about, right, is that, SIP trunking is no longer just about prem-based solutions, right? It's about this direct routing and kind of bring your own SIP to cloud-based environments like Microsoft Teams. And so if you are a SIP trunking provider, as more and more moves to the cloud, you're going to want to get onto you're going to want to get onto this path, right, to help capture that business. And Microsoft has really led the way with this, right, in terms of, the bring your own SIP with the direct routing we're talking here. But there's others, right? We didn't even talk about, Zoom is doing this with their Zoom Phone solution. We see leading providers who have typically bundled SIP with their solution, the UCaaS solutions like RingCentral, now allowing businesses to bring their own SIP. So it's happening. Microsoft is leading the way, and we see that's where the bulk of this activity is. But others are coming, right? And CSPs, right? And Greg mentioned this multiple times. Really need to be able to differentiate to compete going forward. Because so many offerings now are kind of look and feel like a commodity service. So to be able to compete and go forward, you need to figure out how you differentiate in that regard. So at this point, okay, let's have Greg come back in, and let me pull up the Q&A, and we have a lot. So just as a point, if we don't get to all the questions, we have captured them all, and we will work with, trying to get, direct answers to you guys. So, so here's the first question. So, is there a ratio of team users to how many SIP channels for direct routing? For example, let's say a company has 100 employees and they're going to use Teams for calling, right? And so roughly how many SIP channels will they need? I have an answer. Greg, I bet you have an answer too. So I don't know. Do you want to take that first?
Sure. I think kind of, it varies based on size. The smaller the company, the more trunks you need relative to the number of employees, obviously, because you need a certain number of concurrent calls that you can manage. But I think the general rule of thumb is 10 to 1 on a, mid to large size enterprise.
I think it depends on, we look at that when I've done some sizing in this regard, and not even with Teams, this is with SIP, period, right? This is with anyone moving to SIP trunking, not just with Microsoft, Teams. You have to look at what the call volume is, right? And I think that, you have to think about how many simultaneous calls does your company typically have at its peak, right? If you're 100 employees at one location, and your peak is between certain hours, how many people are on the phone, and that's how many channels you're going to need. But I would also say that many SIP trunking providers today, and and this extends to this direct routing, are pretty dynamic in the sense that if you, and they'll work with you on that and figuring out what that looks like. But also, if you have peak times that you have underestimated, you can often burst above and beyond that, right? So you all of a sudden aren't dropping calls, right, or leaving callers like, with busy signals and stranded because you just don't have enough capacity. And I think that's a pretty important criteria when you're looking at a provider, or if you are a provider, making sure you make that pretty clear to your customers, right, that is an option, and that you can work with it to figure what that looks like as time goes on. Now, if you're 100 employees and you're a pure call center, then you're going to need a lot more than 10 channels, right? You're probably going to need 100 channels, right? Yeah. So it just depends on what the business is and how many, calls that are happening at the same time. If you could be a business where there isn't much external calling, in or out, outbound or inbound. And, so maybe you don't need 10, maybe you need 7 channels, right, per 10 employees. So, okay. What are Greg, this is a question for you. What are the prerequisites I need to have in place to install Ribbon other than SIP trunking? Well, it's not an either or. So you want to kind of tackle that?
You got to run that by me again. I just missed a little of it. What are the prerequisites?
Yeah. What are the prerequisites I need to have in place to install Ribbon other than SIP trunking? So I don't think it's not an either or.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume if you're saying, hey, I want, and I don't know if this is an end user asking the question or a service provider, but obviously you literally could use the Azure Marketplace. If you're an end user, you could use the Azure Marketplace, go up and get a trial started, and if you had existing SIP trunks, and connect them. Have to reroute them.
Reseller. Yeah, that's a reseller that asked that question.
Yeah. So I mean, that it's very straightforward. Or if you wanted just to acquire a physical box and you're a reseller, you could go to somebody like Westcon and acquire it. Those are the steps.
Here's a really good question. Do we need to spin up a separate SBC in Azure for every client, or could we use a shared infrastructure, one SBC with a larger capacity, right, supporting multiple clients using Teams? That's a great question.
Well, there is some nuance there to that answer, but generally speaking, it's one per customer, not per site, but typically one per customer. And that, again, you have to think about things like security certificates and other things. So it's typically done on a one customer to one element basis. And that might sound, I don't know, extreme or whatever, inefficient, but it's a cloud-based capability. If it's a physical presence, then obviously you would need it at that physical site. So in that case, it's moot. But if it's from a cloud perspective, it's not really relevant whether it's multi-tenant or not. You can centrally manage them as one entity.
Yep. So here's one that's probably pretty relevant for today, and this is from a telco, right? It says, does having SBCs in the cloud help out with the work from home environment that is now necessary for nearly all business? In other words, would this protect everyone using the service, whether they are working in the office or from their home?
Well, certainly.
It depends on how the voice. It depends on how the voice traffic is being routed, right?
Routed, right? Yeah. I mean, there's never a bad time to have security. Let's be honest. And certainly, as a carrier, you want to have a robust security for your own core, right? So the edge device is there for two reasons, right? In a business environment, one is to protect the carrier from something bad happening on the enterprise network, and conversely, it's also there to protect somebody from getting into the enterprise network using that IP path, right? So it has two purposes. In a home environment, obviously it's not necessarily germane in that environment, but from a core perspective, you always want the end user to connect to some way securely to your network, and the SBC is the normal edge.
So here's a question. This is a I won't call out who they resell, but they are a telco reseller, right? So they're a SIP trunking reseller or a network connectivity reseller, and they're asking, right? So instead of selling Teams or direct routing through coming from the telco, they would like to use a prem-based SBC, right, to tie existing customer premise equipment and Teams together, right? So that's really kind of the point, right? They want to tie,
absolutely.
And you mentioned that, right? Maybe you have a call center, right? So, or maybe you are going to keep a few people on, maybe a Cisco call manager or an Avaya system, but also with Teams. Are other business partners doing this?
Yes, this is extremely common, and we spend a lot of time, and I apologize for that, maybe talking about what's happening in Azure, but a very common use case is that someone deploys either something like our SBC 1000 or 2000 or one of our EdgeMark portfolio, and they drop it on site. They centrally, they use zero-touch provisioning, set the whole thing up from their network, and then they physical interfaces on it, either analog FXX ports or PRI, or they just use SIP to SIP. So maybe they have a Cisco call manager set up today with SIP trunks, and they use the SBC as a SIM ring device so that they can fork the calls and ring both the legacy Cisco phone and the Teams device, wherever it happens to be. That's a super common migration strategy. And then you touched on the other one, which is you might do any or all of those for a call or contact center. So, yeah, that's extremely common. And I think probably in the short term, that might be the most common scenario.
Right. Yes, I know of several large enterprises who are moving all their calling or the PBX functionality SIP trunk or to Microsoft Teams. However, there are a few little exceptions, right? that there will not be. So it's you have these hybrid environments that will probably persist for a while. This is another good question. And is it possible to integrate SIP trunks with Microsoft Teams without the use of an SBC?
It's not. Microsoft requires an SBC for direct routing. That's a simple answer to that. A certified SBC.
Yep. Okay. Gosh, more questions are coming in. So let me. There's so many good questions. Okay.
Well, while you're sorting through, there was one I caught earlier, which is someone said, "Well, what about the Microsoft calling plans?" Right? I saw that pop up.
Yeah.
And
so
that's
Microsoft
a good
calling
question.
Versus direct routing.
Yeah. So, Microsoft calling plans are perfectly viable. The challenge or the issue with them is, one, they're only available in a certain number of countries, a handful of large countries. So if you have a worldwide presence, that's a bit of a challenge. And the other thing is, the way they're priced, they have a relatively high fixed monthly cost. I mean, they're not unreasonably priced. I don't mean to suggest that. But if you're a large enterprise and you're paying per seat, per month, per user, that number is going to add up very, very quickly, because we talked earlier about, hey, how many SIP trunks do I need per 100 users? Well, in the case of Microsoft Calling Plan, you would need 100 seats of Microsoft Calling Plan for 100 users. And the economics of that just don't work as you scale up, because you don't get that 10-to-1 ratio or whatever the ratio is. Where Microsoft Calling Plans make a lot of sense is in that SMB environment, sub 20 users. It's super easy and probably cost effective to do that. So I think you'll see a fair take rate in that space. Now, that doesn't mean that direct routing can't be competitive price-wise there. It just may be an ease of use thing that drives people to use the calling plans on some of the smaller locations. I would think most VARs could undersell the calling plans, and Microsoft themselves has made that clear.
So here's, and I don't know if we might have time for two more questions, but here's one. It says, do we still need class of service voice RT for SIP trunks delivered centrally to a ribbon virtual SBC, or is best effort okay?
Well, I mean, there's always benefit to any. That's an easy answer, which is you always want to use QoS anywhere you can. There's never a bad time for QoS. So it's preferable if it's available. And, there's a lot of infrastructure. Pretty much everything today has some sort of QoS function in it. You do gain some value, obviously, if you can do things like, if you have a physical SBC on site, you'll gain some value from some of the traffic shaping tools that are built into that. But I don't think it's critical to having a good experience.
Here's a question. I think, okay, so what are the key remote working considerations in putting together a Microsoft Teams dial-out solution to replace the PBX?
Well, I think if I understand that question, That's probably around dial plan and access. So you do have to think about that. There are some quirks around that. So you may want, if you have a lot of branch offices, you may want to think about what am I going to do with existing telephone numbers, and to what extent do I need a local presence? And then you need, if you're going worldwide, because you can do it worldwide, you need to think about, well, if I'm in, if I'm in London and I want to call the local Indian restaurant in London, I don't want to do it by dialing through a number in New York. So I think no different than any other kind of a worldwide network, but Teams magnifies it because everyone can be everywhere. You do need to think about what's my expectation of my customers calling a local number, and what's my requirement to have employees be able to dial out locally wherever they might be working. And that, to me, sort of drives that. And I think I answered that question. I don't know whether you think I did or not, but I think that's kind of what they were getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you think about the other thing I would say is that when you have things in the cloud, right, and in this case, Microsoft Teams, right, I mean, that should theoretically, by the nature of it being in the cloud, is going to very easily support remote workers, right?
Yeah.
Because, you can really, access that service, access your clients, which includes the soft client. If so you don't have to have a physical phone, as long as you have the soft client where you can receive and send, phone calls. It doesn't matter where you're working, right? So just by the nature of it being in the cloud, like any cloud voice and UC service, it's naturally very well suited to a remote working environment, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so we don't actually have any more time for questions. There's a lot, and as I mentioned, and some of these are very specific to Ribbon. You have some technical questions on support and licensing. We have captured all the questions. And the Ribbon team and myself will have access to all of them, and we will work through getting answers to everyone, because there was a lot of questions that kept coming in. So just be aware that we do have them. So Alan, I'm going to pass it to you for to final wrap up.
Guys, thanks, Diane. I want to thank everyone for participating on the webinar today and for submitting all those questions and comments. As Diane mentioned, we did receive a large number of questions, so our panel will be following up with you via email after the webinar. I do want to thank Diane for leading our webinar today, and as well thanking Greg for this very detailed and engaging discussion. So thanks to everyone. An archived version of this webinar will be made available shortly. In fact, we'll be sending you a follow-up email on how to access that archive, or you can simply use that same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Feel free to come back, view this session again, or even share it with your colleagues. Now, you will see a short survey that will pop up at the conclusion of this webinar. We'd love to get your feedback, so please take a few moments to fill that out. And also continue to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn for information on future webinars from Omdia, brought to you by Informatech. So again, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Alan.